Okay, let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back from lunch. I have a really nice presentation for you, mapping to your biorhythm right now, because now you ate a lot, you're a little bit sleepy. I have a full presentation without a single line of code for you, okay? And I call it the promised land, because I'll take you on a journey. Just about myself, my name is Tobias Komischke. I work at Infogistics. Everybody knows Infogistics? Okay, awesome, cool. So we are a US-based company. We provide front-end controls and tools and services around front-end design and development. And we also have an office here in London. And I've been doing that UX stuff for a while, and every presentation I give, I always show that cartoon. Because that cartoon many years ago was the first thing I ever saw about the whole topic of usability engineering, as we called it back then. And I think it's still applicable today, in that we want to avoid situations where a user doesn't know where he or she has come from, where he or she is at, and what can be done next. But obviously, UX today is more than that. This is like classical usability. UX is a little bit more than that. And I just want to talk a little bit about what UX is in general. Because if you have experienced UX talks before, they tend to be very specific to things. There may be presentations about research, about screen level design, about evaluation. It's a lot of stuff. And I just want to get a little bit on top of that and like give a more holistic view on what UX is and what it should be and what it can be. So to a lot of companies, UX is kind of like the promised land. They have heard about it, they know about the impact. They hear about all these success stories, and they just want to get there, and they don't know exactly how to get there, and oftentimes they don't even know what UX actually is. They just know we want to get there because the sky is blue and the grass is green. We need to be there. And how do you get there? Well, UX happens in a lot of places, and also happens a lot in the work environment. If you see a scene like this, a good-looking woman sitting in a really nice, well-lit office, having really a blast at doing the work. That is part of what UX is, because the way that we assume she would work here, having so much fun, is that she uses systems that make total sense. It allows her to accomplish tasks that she has to do in a work environment, in an effective way, in an efficient way, and in a way that is satisfactory to her, is comfortable for her. That's why she's so smiling. This is a different situation. This is now not the office environment. This is not people using business applications. This is more the private context now. So two people looking at the same UI and still having fun. The interesting thing between this and the previous slide is here we talk about consumer applications. And with any consumer good, the interesting thing is that the customer is actually the user, which means that if the product doesn't hit the mark, they return it, they want their money back very, very quickly. While for business applications, investment goods, typically the customer is not the user, which means there's no direct feedback, as it pertains to the satisfaction of the user to the product, right? Here it's very direct. So here, if these two girls would look at a software that would not hit their needs, they would not be as happy, and instead they would just give it back, and then you have loss of revenue. Or look at this one here. So here there's a guy, and he's doing something on the UI, and if you look at the UI, it's not really complicated, right? I mean, this looks like Pong in 1975. It's not a very sophisticated UI, considering that he's the age of Minecraft and League of Legends, like really powerful games, and still he has fun, right? He seems to enjoy himself, and because he enjoys himself, his mother enjoys herself as well. He's happy, she's happy, everybody's happy. So in this specific context, which is more like a public setting, and this guy just walks up to this and tries to navigate this guy here through this chasm, I don't know. it's a good thing for him and everybody is happy. It's another example of user experience. And here's another user experience. So this guy may not be completely, enjoying what he's doing, and he could do everything at this point, right? Maybe he was just navigating an e-commerce site and wanted to buy new running shoes, and now he's on page 7 out of the purchasing process and has to re-enter the same information he already did 2 screens ahead. Not a very pleasant situation. Not a happy camper either. And why is that? Well, this is now again the situation where it's more in the office. And it's funny because when I started doing this 15 years ago, and we were doing consulting, companies always paid us money to work on the external facing systems. They always said, well, these are the windows to the customers, these are directly generating revenue. We have to really be good with them. But everything that works on the inside, internal facing applications, that don't worry about it. It's our own people who have to use them. Yeah, we don't have to make them good. 15 years ago, that was a real strong argument. It was very hard to get through that. But today, if she's working on an internal application for her company, who says that she doesn't have to be productive? So who says that the software doesn't have to be super efficient and effective? It's the same criteria that you would apply for external facing software as well. Also about the user satisfaction, which sometimes is tended to look at like a little bit esoteric. It's like, oh no, now you have to make people happy too on the inside? Really? Yeah, really, because you can show that user satisfaction has a direct impact on the bottom line of a company. So people that work with substandard software during the day, they go home after work and they have the newest iPad and they have the newest apps that work and run on the iPads. So they know what's good and what's not good. And so in today's world, when there's a shortage of really qualified knowledge workers, you better give them high standards and good well-produced software. As a side note, in the UK, I think UK is one of the few countries in the world you actually can sue your employer against when they give you substandard or software that is not ergonomically well designed. You can even sue them here. So that's just to say that it doesn't matter if it's internal, if it's external facing, UX applies throughout. And so what is UX? There's more definitions than there are stars in the sky. But I happen to like this one here, which says it's the envisioned, expected, or actual experience of a user interacting with a technical product. I like this definition because it's pretty concise in that, for example, it talks about the interaction with a technical product. So when I call a support line of a company because my Surface Pro keeps crashing every other week, and I have somebody who's completely incompetent on the other line, that's not user experience. That's customer experience. User experience is the interaction with the technical system right there and directly. So that's interesting. The other interesting thing is that we don't only talk about the actual experience, but we also talk about the envisioned and expected experience. The envisioned experience is what the producer wants that software to be. So we want to create a new app. We want to create a new Office application. What experience do we envision it to be? High-end, snazzy, technical, precise, game-like? All this is what we have to decide. But we do this before we build the application, then hope that in the end it actually stand up to that target. The other one is the expected experience, and that talks about the expectation a user brings to the application even before he or she uses that application. Again, for the consumer world where the customer is the user, if you pay a lot of money for an application, you pay $50 for an app on the App Store. For that $50, you have quite some expectations, right? So it's you anticipate the use of this, and you have certain expectations to this. And if the application doesn't fulfill that expectation, then you feel that you got betrayed and you want your money back. So that's why I like this. It talks about process, right? The actual experience we can easily measure. There's thousands of methods for this. That's not a challenge. But to understand what the envisioned experience should be, what the expected experience should be, that talks about process, which means that you have to take care about user experience throughout a development lifecycle or even an application lifecycle. And the three typical target criteria that are always mentioned for what user experience is or what a well-designed product is a product has to be useful, usable, and desirable. So useful means it has to be meaningful. It has to provide means to accomplish something. It has to be the right thing. Usable means it's easy to learn, it's easy to use, ease of use, usability, learnability, all these kind of attributes. And desirable means that it has value. It is engaging. People like to use it. And you see here completely different dimensions, right? Because useful is having the right product. This is building the right product the right way. And this is having it a rapport between the system and the user. So it's quite hard to accomplish this. And typically, there's also different roles here involved with doing this. Because the usefulness typically is not necessarily owned by UX designers, but that's owned by the product owner, the product manager. But UX can help to identify what our user needs to make it actually meaningful and useful. All right, so how do we get there? How do you get to a system that complies with these kind of quality standards? Did you ever hear about design thinking? Anybody? Design thinking? It's a term that came up like in the 60s, and nobody knew about it, nobody cared about it either. But in the 80s, there was and there still is, a company in the US called IDEO, and they had made this concept very, very popular. And it basically says that you deploy, execute, and carry out design thinking if you do these kind of things. You show empathy, you do ideation, you do iterations, and you exude some level of rationality. So let me just show you what this encompasses. Empathy is not feeling sorry for somebody or feeling pity for somebody. Empathy talks about understanding who's using your product, in what kind of context to do what. And that by definition means if the approach of a company is to have a lone designer in cubicle land and then dream up the next generation awesome application, chances that they would fail is really high. Why? Because she's working in isolation. She works in her cube and has no idea about what's going on outside in the world. What are the real needs? What are the real users and what are their characteristics? So empathy talks about really understanding who's the target audience, for what is the application going to be used, and what problems are going to be solved with the application. And this, again, can be a business application because you need to help somebody enter new customer records. This could be a consumer app that lives on the Apple Store. It doesn't matter, but you need to know and anticipate who is going to be using your application or your system. And that means you have to know where the music plays. You have to know where things are used. If you are designing and developing a system that is going to be used in hospitals, I've been doing this for a couple of years, hospital information systems. Well, wouldn't it be interesting and important to know what's actually going on in a hospital? Actually going there and trying to figure out what's going on in a nurse station, for example. So who's working at the nurse station? How many people are working in that nurse station? What's the lighting conditions here on the floor? How come that here's a monitor and here more monitors? How does a shift handover work? What's the interaction between the clinicians, between a nurse and the physician, for example? What's going on and what does it mean for a system? Again, not trying to design anything in the vacuum without knowing the reality out there in the world. And it doesn't matter what industry you talk about. Here we talk about industrial process control systems. You know those SCADA systems that they use here? Highly complex systems that show you what's happening with a technical production process. Okay, if you go into a control room like this, it's very interesting to see what's going on. Look at the details, the nuances, right? This guy sits there and he has a headrest. He has an armrest. So it appears to me that this guy sits there quite for a while. It's not a casual, oh, let's sit down and check an email and then go out to somewhere else. This guy sits there all the time. 1 mouse, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 mice on that desk. What does that mean? Is this guy operating 4 different systems with 4 mice? Or are there 4 guys or gals sitting next to each other and operating this system? What does that mean? How do you distribute work amongst people? What does that mean for design? All this is stuff that's really important to know. Look at the different angles, look at the different machinery, hardwired systems, completely digital screens that show the process. This here, whatever this is, alarm lists, closed circuit TV here. There's a lot of stuff to be seen here. But if you sit in your cubicle and just dream up stuff, how would you know about that? You can interview subject matter experts right and left, but would they be actually able to tell you all these nuances, or how much would it actually benefit you just seeing this live and in person? And my third example is more in the consumer app world again. Well, if you provide systems where the target audience may be students at college, well, isn't it interesting to know how they actually work? It was very eye-opening for me because we did a project with student information systems where students would enroll in classes online and these kind of things. And what I never even thought about was that today no students has a computer anymore. I mean, this is actually outdated today, that people have laptops. Today they all have tablets, if not phones. And in the US, it's almost that the majority of the students now has actually only phones. They do a lot of stuff from their phones only. And so knowing that, knowing the situation that they live in, like dorm rooms and what's happening there, and they put their TV or their monitor in front of the window and everything is a little bit compressed in terms of space. That's all interesting to know. How do they use the devices? And talking about like authenticity, to go where the music plays. Here you have these, old worn socks. Here you have a fan. Perfect combination. So by doing this, by really trying to understand what's the reality out there, what we try to do is and get answers to these kind of questions. All these typical W questions that we always encourage the kids to ask, we should ask the same questions. What is it? What is it that people do? What is it that people need? What is it that people like? What is it that people dislike? Who do we talk with? Who are the user groups? When we talk with customers, oftentimes we ask that question, who are your users? And we think it's the most trivial question of all questions. And then it turns out of a room of 10 people, we get 10 different answers because there's no agreement on who the users are. Are there different user groups? If yes, what's the difference between user group 1 and 2? What is the difference? Is it the difference in position, in seniority, in background, in whatever? And what does that actually mean? You want then to build a system that is like geared and tailored to individual user groups? Or you want to hit every user group in the world with one application, like an e-commerce shop? It's interesting to know. Where is the system going to be used? Is this in a regular office with controlled lighting and people sit 90 degrees to the next window, everything is perfect, they have ergonomic chairs? Or is this an application that is used anywhere? In the subway, in the parking lot? Maybe a sales guy has to use this on a phone, and while he's at the parking lot of the next client, he has to just like review the intel about this client in the parking lot. That actually has design implications. because you have a mobile device, you have a phone, and you take this outside in the sun glare on the display swallows a lot of your contrasts. Just right there, it has design implications. Just one example. Or think about these hospital IT systems, right? Radiology information systems that are read in a dark room traditionally. Well, if you're operating in a dark room, your screen should be dark as well, because it's easier on the eyes. While again, in your office environment where everything is light and bright, it can and should be light. So direct implications on the design. When is it going to be used? Is this used 8 hours a day? Hardcore data entry stuff. Or is this used maybe for your income tax statement? Maybe you're using a software to do your income taxes. How often do you do this a year? Once. And so you do this, and you may spend a weekend on this, and then it takes a whole year until you do this again, during which time you may forget a lot of things, or maybe the company wants to upgrade some things but knows that there's only one chance that people will adopt to this because it's the one time during the year that people prepare their income taxes. That's a big difference then. Then obviously the golden question, why? Why is it that people, for example, struggle with this one legacy application? Why is it that they would want to do things differently? But notice that the only question that we don't necessarily ask here is how. Because how is design. This is just understanding the reality. This is empathy. This is understanding what's going on. With that information, we can then ask ourselves, okay, how can we make the situation better? How can we produce something that is of use for people? But it's not something that we would need to ask right here when we try to understand the context in this discovery phase. And just as an example, the outcome of that, for example, could be personas. I'm not sure if you heard about personas before. Personas are stand-ins for the real users. They are like really compressed, prototypical descriptions of what a target user could be. And we at one point in time did personas for our own clients, which are mainly developers. And so we had Brian here, for example. And so we defined Brian in that, here's core statements of his, here's kind of like what he does, here's a little bit about his professional background, and here's just like other bits and pieces about him. And so we printed those out, we made placemats for those for the cafe. We had these life-size cutouts produced that we just like put into meetings and like referred back to Brian when somebody said, oh, I think we need this and this and this feature for our next release. You would say, okay, how would Brian profit from that? How does it change his work life? So he was just like a part of meetings at this point, and people like put him in a t-shirt and they made selfies with him and whatnot. So the first thing was empathy. The next thing is now ideation. What ideation means is that now that we know what's real, we know the context in which the system is going to be used, we can now think about how we solve the issue at hand, how we can provide value and usefulness to our user audience. And the way that is done is called ideation, because it's not starting to program the solution once we know what's going out there. Because if we start programming and we are hitting the actual target platform and we use code, it's just like the one shot we got. Instead, with ideation, we want to try out different things. We want to ideate. We want to provide different ways things can be solved. And that doesn't have to be in code. This doesn't even have to be with the prototyping tool at the beginning. This can literally be pencil on a napkin or write something on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard, doesn't matter. But what you see here is just ideas, what it could be. Doesn't mean that it will be, but it could be that kind of stuff. Wireframes, sketches that show the content, that show layout of important elements on a canvas. And it also shows a sense of workflow, in that there's a sense of navigation in here. And so why is this not done in code yet? Because it's much more cost efficient to do it this way, because here we just want to have ideas. We want to show, hey, for this need, we can do it this way, this way, this way, this way, or this way. And so not everything here has to be perfect. For example, does it really make sense to offer to switch on and password on and off when we actually just asked to actually put in a password? Maybe, maybe not. But it's an idea. This is sometimes called the diamond. And Bill Buxton from Microsoft uses this all the time, but he just stole it too, like I did. So this is ideation. You want to be divergent. You want to create a lot of options to then discuss them and say, well, what does make sense and what does not? If something doesn't make sense, hey, it's not in code yet. You throw it away and do another version. No problem. It's very cost efficient. But obviously, in the end, we have to do a convergence and say, well, in the end, you have to produce something. I cannot just continue coming up with new ideas. So I first open the design space, and then I have to actually bring it down to my final solution. And how do you do this? This point here, where you have all the options, but now I have to decide on, okay, what do I do going forward? How do I converge now to the final solution? This is why and where we want to use iterations. So iterations are just like circles of the design that are focused and bring in, again, the reality from the outside. So here is when we want to do, for example, validations. When we want to discuss concepts with stakeholders, with end users, doing usability testing, or focus groups, whatever methods we want to use, A/B testing, just to make sure that we go from here, from where we have all the ideas, to the right solution. Because there's always more than one perfect solution in the end, but to get there, you have to make decisions. And the idea here is to make the decisions through iterations. Don't shoot for the one solution in one straight shot, but do it iteratively. And one classical way to do this, and a very strong way, if not the best way, is usability testing. So here is a situation where you have people interacting with the technical system in some way. And then you have this James Bond mirror, one-way looking mirror, and on the other side you have a control room with a lot of devices that allow you to control the cameras and to record everything and to take notes of things. But the people here are not distracted because they cannot see in, but they can see out. And so what usability testing is all about is, again, getting the reality into your process. And that is, now that you know what's going on out there in the field through your empathy phase, now that you have done a certain amount of design, you want to know, can people engage with our concept the way we envisioned it, the way we anticipated that? And so you basically expose your concepts to your user audience and ask them to carry out tasks that they would be familiar with, but with a system they may have never seen, and then see what happens. You ask them to verbalize what they are doing, and you get measurable feedback in terms of you can count how many times you had to provide assistance, how many errors did they take if you define errors, how long task execution times were. And since they also speak, you get an insight as to where the problems are, because they may wandering around the screen with the eyes and say, I know I have to submit my input now. I have no idea how I submit something here. And you see that they really try to find this one element that you may have not called submit, but something else, and they cannot find it. That's the idea about usability testing. And based on that, you can then optimize your concept and say, okay, now that I know where the problems are, I can work towards mitigating those problems. And the beautiful thing here is that this is not market research, where you have to be representative and you have to test 4,000 people. This works with very few people already. So as a rule of thumb, you can hit about 80% of the easy-to-find usability problems by actually testing with 8 persons only. So again, super cost-efficient. And who would argue against those results? Sometimes you're in this big stakeholder meetings, and everybody has an opinion about the UI, and I like this, I hate this, I like green, I like red. It's all opinions. They're worth nothing. But this here is empirics. If this guy here happens to actually cut a highlight tape of these test sessions and shows the same problem reoccurring every single time over 10 people, who would argue against that? You show this to the project manager and say, well, I think we need to do something here because nobody figured out how to submit the form. So, all right, you have a really good point for argument here. Now, does it always mean that when you want to just validate your design concepts, that you have to have a high-end usability lab, or you have to rent one, or you have to outsource this? Good news is no. This is usability testing. Same thing, just without a lab. Same idea. You give her a task to do. She's trying out on your concept. If this is just a mock-up, if this is a prototype, this could be a paper prototype. It doesn't matter. But she experiences something and tries to find out how to use a software. And you just sit there and watch her and see what happens. That's usability testing. You don't need the high-end lab necessarily. Okay, and I say this, I literally grew up in the lab like this. The first 5 years, that's what I've been doing. And I always say there's pros and cons. It's like the pro is obviously it's like complete controllability, right? It's like lab rats. It's like everything is controlled. On the other side, you bring people in and they see this James Bond mirror and they know there's somebody on the other side, maybe laughing their asses off about you because you make a mistake. It makes them uneasy. They see the remote camera swirling around and they hear them. It makes them uneasy. So something like this is more casual. It's easier. It's more comfortable for the test participants you want to use here. So there's no problem with that. The purpose is just get the reality in your process and don't dream it up in your cube. So that is design thinking. Empathy, ideation, iteration, and rationality. Rationality was this usability test, for example. Getting the reality in. Trying to remove opinions and belief systems and replace them with knowledge. Rationality doesn't always have to be bringing back empirical data. Rationality can also mean that, for example, you design against design principles that you made up as a company or as a product team for a specific product. And say, for example, for us, learnability is super, super critical because you have an application where people have to get up to speed. From the transition from the novice state to the expert state should be really, really fast. So for that reason, maybe for you, learnability is super, super important. If that is one of your design principles, you can then vet your concepts, your prototypes against that kind of principle and see, well, is it really learnable enough? And you can do this through modeling. You can use this, try to prove this through usability testing, no matter what. But it's rational. It's not sitting in a room and everybody fights about certain things without knowing anything, and then the guy with the highest seniority wins the battle. That's not the idea about this. So design thinking solves half of all your problems you will ever have in UX. That's the good news. It's a way of living. It's a way of thinking about products and systems, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient yet. The other thing is design knowing. It's good to be the person who always does design thinking and always thinks about the user, but at the end of the day, somebody has to create a product. Just talking about it and knowing things is not enough. You need knowledge to apply on a design level. And so it's things like human factors, design principles, methods, processes, and standards. Have you ever heard about human factors, what that actually is? Heard the term before, at least? Yes? Oftentimes, human factors is synonymous with ergonomics. It's just ergonomics typically more talk about hardware stuff, like the shape of a chair or a desk, and these kind of like physical properties. Human factors is more the adjustment of software to the human based on cognitive abilities. And that is actually a pretty interesting field. I just leave this up now for 20 more minutes, and you let me know if you get really dizzy. So human factors is about understanding how our brain works. It's understanding what our abilities are, what our capabilities are, and also what our limitations are in terms of processing information, perceiving information, memorizing information, and then applying that kind of knowledge to user interfaces. And it just happens that things like these happen far too often. And this is like old knowledge, but just people don't know about it. And that is any lens, any glass, prism, including the lenses that we have in our eyes, break wavelengths of light unequally. And just because blue and red are on the opposing ends of the visual spectrum, if you put them close to each other, we cannot see them both sharp at the same time. It just is not possible because they're too different. And yet you see this everywhere, that people bring blue and red close to each other all the time with like red font on a blue background and whatnot, because maybe some people think it's attractive, maybe it's a nice color combination or something. But it's always creating this blurry effect. Even here with the projector, right? You see this on my tablet, it's even worse. But even on the projector here, it's not a very clean image. It's fuzzy and blurred because we cannot see this sharp at the same time. And it's something you could know, and designers should know. The same goes true for designing websites and thinking about, well, would the people find the right information, the salient information that we want them to see on our website? And yeah, you can find that out if you do, again, A/B testing, usability testing, whatever. But we also know that in the Western world, we tend to read from the top to the bottom and from the left to the right. And this is just from eye tracking a result that shows the so-called F-shaped pattern that people use when they read websites. And that is, they start on the top left and they go right, they go back and go down and go a little bit right, and this forms an F. That's the typical way people in the Western world that read from left to right look at this website. Obviously, you go to other areas, the Middle East, they read from right to left, it's different. In the West, this is the pattern. And obviously, other salient elements, saliency based on position, contrast, size, etc., also draw some attention, but this is this F that is very well known. And if we know that, why would we then waste time and resources to run this through A/B testing or do usability testing on this when we already know the answer? We want to reserve those resources for things that we don't know yet. Or this one here is a classic. There's a reason why graphical user interfaces are so successful since they came up in the 80s. Before, we had these command line interfaces. And the problem with that is that you have to recall the syntax and the format of your entries here, right? There's no cues. Yeah, if you use Visual Studio, you get autocomplete and that kind of stuff, but you still have to recall at least how to start something, right? Here, you have to know what's your syntax for a certain command. So this is recall. This here, on the graphical user interface, is recognition. As in, oh, there's something I can do with a file. Interesting, let's click there. Oh, all these things I can do with a file. That's interesting. I can create a new file. I can open a file. There's no syntax that you actually have to put in there. All you do is you click on something that you recall. And it's just another thing that comes from cognitive psychology, that recognition is far better than recall in terms of error proneness and performance that people will actually show. And that is why graphical user interfaces are so superior, but it also means that whenever you have the decision to make on the UI, if you want to show something and have people then react on something that you show to them, or have them put in something that they may not know. This here is always the better way to do it. Also has been known for now 60 years, even before we had personal computers. Okay, and what about icons? I don't assume that anybody here would create icons on your own, but oftentimes you inherit icons because you order icons or you have icon sets that you need to use on your UI. And then again, you get into these fights. Oh, I really don't like this icon set. Oh, why is that? Yeah, I don't like it. Okay, so because of, yeah, I don't like it, what do you do now? It's like, do we order another one? Do we have this redesigned? What do you mean with, oh, I don't like this? This has been researched like anything else. And the icon quality depends basically on three things. One is the concreteness. So how close is what it's shown to the real world counterpart that it's representing. So how close is this magnifying glass to a real magnifying glass? Well, this one is like, it's pretty concrete. This, yeah, it actually looks like a clock. So the more concrete, the better. Next criteria is complexity. The complexity of an icon, the less, the better. So the more prototypical an icon, the better it is. And not by asking people, do you like this more than the other, but actually measuring performance, recognition rates, these kind of things. So the lower the complexity, the better. Especially when you want to have scalable icons that have to be small in some areas, because if you have a super complex and rich icon that works well on 64 by 64 pixels, but then you have to show it in other contexts with 16 by 16, you can forget about all the complexity because you don't have the real estate to show it. And the third criteria for well-organized and designed icons is the semantic distance, which is what it actually shows. Does it represent the function it actually does? So for example, if you have a magnifying glass with a plus on it, and when you click on this, you print the page, that's not good. That's a huge, high semantic distance. So again, the less, the better. All this has been researched, and that may actually help with actually putting some rationality into what kind of icons do we want to use. Okay, now we talk about design principles. And I have an own session about this tomorrow if you're interested about visual design for non-designers, where I talk about this more detailed. So here it's more on a high level. The first design principle I want to show is hierarchy. Hierarchy here, we have all these triangles. From a hierarchical perspective, this is the number one, and this is a number two. And why is this interesting? Not only because it's very easy to perceive. We can perceive these kind of things even pre-attentively before we actually think about this, meaning faster than 200 milliseconds. But it's also interesting because we can use this to steer visual attention on the UI. We can use this to explain to people what is signal and what is noise on our screen. For example, here, everybody looked at the first line, even though I clearly told you not to do this. What were you thinking? Because from a hierarchy perspective, this here is much more prominent. And why is that? Well, first is position. It was reading from top to the bottom, the first one you saw. Second of all, it's more salient because of the contrast. Text to background, high contrast, low contrast. Third of all, the size of the text. This size is larger than this size. Fourth of all uppercase characters, all lowercase characters. Fifth of all, exclamation mark, period. So all these contributed to the fact that you read the first one, even though I wanted you to read this first. Okay, now what does it mean on a screen? Look at this here, for example. This was at one time our project management tool that we used. And let's look at the hierarchy here, right? So first we see a pretty stark contrast in that this Chrome area here for the infrastructure is very dark. It's a dark gray. And then the content area here is white. So the Chrome here frames our UI. So it makes us really clear to see that there has to be a really big difference in between here, because this here is primary navigation where you set what you want to look at. So now I wanted to look at settings. Now here within this light canvas, the hierarchy is rather straightforward in that we see 3 items with large text positioned on top. Seems to me that these allow me to look at settings for users or for the account or do some custom branding settings. Okay. And then once I selected user in this case, I get another level where I can do all these things that I can do for a user. And then I have the actual forms where I can do something. So this is, for example, how hierarchy is applied. Is this the best UI you've ever seen in your life? Probably not. It's a little bit gray in gray, Battleship, and the difference here between what's enabled or selected and what is not could be a little bit stronger too, but in terms, just to like show and highlight the use and application of hierarchy, I think it works well here. Another interesting design principle is balance. And I find this super interesting because symmetry on a UI has been shown for decades now to very heavily influence the aesthetic perception. So you show something to people that is organized, symmetric, and balanced versus something that is cluttered and unorganized, and they will always rate the organized version better, higher than the other one in terms of aesthetics. And it doesn't matter what aesthetics actually is. That's the hard part, right? What is aesthetics? What is attractiveness? But you just ask people, of these two, cluttered, uncluttered, symmetric, unsymmetric, which one do you like better in terms of aesthetics? And whatever aesthetics means for you, they would choose the ones that is balanced. And not only is it a preference in aesthetics, you can also measure this, that it's better in terms of productivity. In statistics, we are in the Princeton area in New Jersey in the US. And Princeton, they did these fMRI studies, when they put people in the MRI tubes, but it's functional magnetic resonance imagery, so they can actually track what your brain is doing in real time. And they showed people, test participants, images of cluttered scenes versus organized, symmetric, and balanced screens. They used photos of office desks that were organized versus unorganized, but they also used UIs. And they could measure, and they had a publication on that, a neuroscientific publication, that said that the organized and balanced ones yielded a better performance from the brain when it comes to tasks. Because if you have clutter, all you do is try to make sense of this. And you cannot work as focused as if you have already a very organized UI. I actually wrote them an email just asking if it's actually applicable to user interface design, and they said they confirmed that. So it's not only aesthetics, but also performance. If you have both of these on the same side of a discussion, it's a good sign. And so here, for example, this just actually happens to be a website of a company that does front-end design and development, but and they only have these two sides of the coin, design and development. So it's a completely perfect center symmetric website. So this is at any rate something that is easy to perceive and something that would be rated high in terms of aesthetics by people. The third principle I wanted to talk about is association. Association is to show in a visual way what things belong together. So here we have a screen of stripes, but our perception is that we have two groups of stripes. One is this, perfectly straight vertical columns, and then we have those more organically and different sized stripes here on the right. So even that this guy looks very, very different from this guy, we still feel that these belong together more so than this guy with any of these guys. So we can use these kind of principles to show what things belong together. And again, we do this in a productive way to explain to people without writing text and online help how they should interpret a screen on a UI. Here, this is actually a screenshot that I just took last week of our own website, where we brutally violated that principle. And there's now an internal ticket open to fix this issue. So here on our website, at one point, we talk about introducing UX into a client's process. And so we have some text, and we have some photo of really professional-looking people doing really, really hard work. And then at the bottom, we say, yeah, blogs. And so from an association standpoint, this blogs here seems to be part of this dark blog. Because above it's light, below it's white, it has the same background, it has the same kind of font. This looks like this blog has something to do with this area here. And it does not. Actually, this is just the header for what's coming below, which you only understand when you scroll down further, where you see then there's more sections, and the section headers are always a black band with white font on it. So this is not good. This is not good in terms of association. It's not a good design. What needs to happen there is that there's a separation here in between that you see. This is clearly not associated with that area here. Okay, talking about colors. And there's own books. I have full presentations about colors. There's so much to be talked about when it comes to colors. Color contrast, color blindness, color stereotypes, color schemes, all these kind of things. And it's something that can be known because, as I just said, there's countless books about it. There's tons and tons of blogs about it. Once people are more familiar with the role of colors, especially on graphical user interfaces, it enables them to do a better job in creating compelling user interfaces. Because in the end, the one characteristic of a graphical user interface are colors. But colors have so many different roles. They have the role to provide branding value. They have the role to provide status indicators, as in red is bad and green is good. There's so many things to be talked about in colors, even when you think about web accessibility guidelines and what they say about color contrast. Have you ever done like WCAG compliant websites? Anybody? Web content accessibility guidelines. So you have, what level did you use? What level of the guidelines? Level A, AA, AAA? Do you remember? And yeah, and that's fine. I don't want to put you on the spot. But the interesting thing about that is that they have different levels and they get harder and harder. So like to reach a AAA level of these guidelines is very, very hard. And in part, it is because the limits, for example, for color contrasts get ever so hard to accomplish. Like high contrast, people with like really severe perception issues would still need to be able to read and understand your website. And I'm not sure about the situation in the UK, but in the US there's a law that has a section in it that's called Section 508 that applies for every government-run website, that you actually have to apply to these kind of rules with colors and contrast and color blindness, safe colors and these kind of things. And more and more the trend is to apply that rule that is only meant for government-run websites to the private sector again. So people like Walmart, they got sued by somebody with visual impairments for not complying with best practices out there. And they actually cited the Section 508, which is not applicable to Walmart. But it was like the first incidents where like, people tried like to use that in the private sector. And they quickly settled this thing. I mean, they gave that person a couple of millions of dollars just to shut that person up. And then they worked very, very hard to redesign Walmart. So this was just like a side note about colors. Colors is a very big topic. And so is text treatment. In the US, we have a very regarded and influential market analysis company called Forrester. I'm not sure if that's known in the UK. But Forrester Research has done a longitudinal studies for websites, 10 years. Every year they were looking at the usability of public-facing websites, trying to understand what are they good at and what are they bad at. And in the end, they were saying over 10 years, yes, the usability quality has increased because the knowledge is getting more spread around and the systems get better. But the number one issue after 10 years is still issues with text treatment. And that is everything again from text to background contrast, text size, font types, text orientation, alignments, all the good stuff. So you would think it's the most boring topic in the world because it's been known again for decades, even before computers were invented, and still people struggle with it from a design perspective. And again, these are epic rules. They will not change. Why don't they change? Because we don't change. The way we perceive information, process information is pretty constant, and there's research on that one as well. I'm only aware about one rule, only one rule out of all these rules that actually changed in the last 20 years. And it's actually a rule that applies to text treatment. You're aware of serif versus sans serif text? Ever heard about this? You know what these serifs are? So the serifs are these little feet, these little extensions at the periphery of a font. So this would be a serif, and this would be a sans without the feet. And the epic rule always has been that in books where you have 800 dots per inch and more, you can use whatever you want because the resolution is so fine with the font that it's no problem to show these little extensions. But on a screen, if you have a standard PC, you talk about less than 100 pixels per inch. That's nasty when you have fonts, especially when they are small, because you cannot render them and have them really look crisp and clean. They look fuzzy because you don't have the resolution. So that was the epic rule. And guess what? It changed because now, at least for the handheld devices, we talk 320 and more pixels per inch, higher than we actually can resolve with the eyes. It's beyond retina display at this point, which means you can do whatever you want. From a resolution perspective, not a problem. From a UX perspective, pretty awesome. Because the high-res displays came first with the screen readers that allow you to read a book in an electronic way. Well, the serif fonts are typically those that you find in printed. These are the novels and the weekly journals. They use serifs. Now that you have the resolution, you can actually read them in the same font on an electronic device. It's pretty awesome. But literally, that's the only rule that I'm aware that really changed because technology got better. It's until 3:30, right? Okay. So let's talk about methods a little bit. The last thing was just about human factors and design principles. Let's talk about methods. As I said, it's really, really cool and really beneficial to go out there where the real user audience lives of your system. And if it means that you have to go to a hospital because you are creating a radiology information system, you go to a hospital. If you go to a factory because you're doing a SCADA system, you go to the factory. Oftentimes, though, you can't for many, many different reasons. Number one is resource constraints. They don't give you enough time, they don't give you money, they don't give you an opportunity to go out there. Then you say, well, now I still end up in my cube. All I wanted to go out of my cube and know the reality. Now I cannot go out there. So what can I do to get the reality into my process? Well, there's different other methods. And one of them is, for example, using surveys. And if you do surveys, you just have to understand that surveys are really good to get really a broad range of participants. You can send these to thousands of people. and hope and pray for a return rate of 6 to 8%. It's already in the good realm. But the level of insight you get from a survey is very limited, because you ask questions that, closed-ended questions like, would you agree, yes, no, or use these Likert scales, and I fairly agree to what you are saying versus I'm completely good with what you are saying. So it's all standardized. Because of that, your insights will be lower than if you actually talked with people and observed people what they are doing. Having said that, they can still be useful. And then things come to mind. For example, how many steps should if you want to use a Likert scale like these, how many steps should it be? Or somewhere is my, okay, whatever. Here you have 5, from 1 to 5. Should it be 5? Should it be 7? Should it be 9? Should it be 4? Well, 5 and 7 are the classic numbers of scale points here. And the characteristic of a Likert scale is they go from negative to positive. So they are bipolar, which means there is something nasty about them, and that is the midpoint, the number 3 here, the fair. Because that is like the one where people cannot decide. It's like, I don't know, I don't have an opinion. It's like, whatever, just give me the middle. And that's called the central tendency bias. People have the tendency to go into the middle here, and they shy away from giving the extreme answers. Even when you go to a 5-star hotel, and it's like the best of the best, and you probably will never get to a better hotel than this, and in the end you fill out their little customer survey. It's like, yeah, was it really the very good one? Yeah, I think there's room to the top, right? I give it a 4. It's a typical bias, central tendency bias, that people would not do that. So that you have to anticipate, because otherwise you would think that something is completely wrong because you have more, for example, answers in the 4 than 5, not necessarily because of your design, but because of this tendency that people actually have. And that may mean that you have to do pilot testing on your surveys. Try them out before you actually deploy them to thousands of people. And for example, it's not only about, do people understand your questions? Of course, that's what you want to know, right? That's why you're on a pilot. Do people understand what you're asking? But you want to see what the answer patterns are. Because if you have a super strong central bias here, and like the majority of people always go in the middle here, that is like completely worthless, well then, either you have to like tune your questions, or you actually remove the number 3 and do a so-called forced choice design. Forced choice, we eliminate the midpoint. Say now you have to make a call. You're on the affirmative side, which is good and very good, or totally agree and agree, these kind of things. Or I go on the other side where it's more like a disagreement. But we force you to make a choice. You don't see these very often, but they are there and you can obviously happily use them. The other thing is, when you analyze these kind of data, typically, people, what they do is like they take the averages above everything and then say, well, so I had 2,000 people, and on average we had so many people that said very good to this item and good to that item, these kind of things. And it's fine, but in case your boss is like a super nerdy statistician, you actually, in order to do that kind of stuff, you would have to prove that the distance between good and very good is the same distance between very poor and poor, which is kind of trivial here in this case, because they apply these numbers. But things like, how often do you shower? Always versus frequently? Is that distance the same as between never and rarely? You have to statistically show that this is the same distance. Otherwise, you cannot do things like means and these kind of things. You just have to have used different measures like means, modes, and yeah. Now, surveys is one thing. What we do quite a lot is phone interviews, because the phone interviews give you quite a reach, because you can talk with people from the other side of the world. Yeah, you have to get up at night, but at least you can talk with them, and by talking with them, get a deeper insight than with surveys. At the same time, you cannot do this with thousands of people because just of time constraints. So here we talk about maybe dozens of people. And the interesting thing here is that as soon as you have a direct conversation with somebody, there's a certain social biases coming in, such as the social desirability bias, where people tend to answer in a way that they assume is the politically correct way. For example, if she here comes from my company and we create this new flagship product, and we want people to react to that and tell us what's good and bad about it, well, if people know that she works for that company who did that software, by nature she would have a better opinion about that software as if she had no relationship to that. If she just said, I'm here from a market research company and we work for a lot of different companies, I have a question about a certain product for you. If it's that distant from the owners and the generators of the product, the answers will be different. Other things would include things like acquiescence, where when people don't even understand the question, they tend to answer in the affirmative. That's just another thing that we learn from social sciences. You can love it, you can hate it, but it's just the case. And this comes out here and not on the surveys. So just knowing about that is interesting. Obviously, as I said before, the best thing in my mind is actually going where the target audience sits and not only interview people, but also just observe them, see what they are doing, see what the environment looks like. Is it an office? Is it a specific room that was designed for this? What does this guy has on his desk? And then talking about the issue at hand, but also observing. And it then raises the question, well, to what degree do you want to immerse yourself into that situation, right? A super high level of immersion would be that you actually participate in what that person is doing. So it's kind of like, let me play your role for a day. This will teach you a lot about what this activity involves. But you have this reciprocal influence then, right? Because you influence that person influences back to you. It's kind of like when when undercover cops go bad, that's the effect of it, because they're too immersed. On the other end of that same spectrum, an approach that would be very minimalist in terms of participation or immersion would be, you show up, you put it in a camera, let the camera run for 36 hours, come back, grab the camera. And then you can analyze, to whatever degree you want, that footage later. So that's probably not the best that you can do, because you don't understand the why. You see things happen, you have no insight as to why they happen. You may see this guy clicking around on his screen and doing things, you have no idea why. But you still influence the situation. By just going there and putting the camera in there, you actually influence and change the real situation there. We did task analysis in power distribution centers, like the guys who make sure that the households and the factories have power. And it always took us months to get a permission to any particular facility, because the managers there were afraid that we would come in there and with cameras and everything, and we would actually record grave mistakes that people can do. Because I'm not sure if it's the same today, but when I did this 10 years ago, one of these dudes could literally click a software button and could switch off half a country of the grid with one button. And they were like, guys, when you come in there, you make these people nervous, because now you talk about cameras and they don't know who you're from. You don't also quite understand what you're actually there for. Are you there to replace them with automation? And then you also are recording everything. So if they are doing a mistake, that's really a problem for them, but it's also a problem for us, because now it's on tape. So there's a lot of hurdles to actually get the chance to go out there. But if you do I can promise you get the best results there because it's unfiltered. It's not second hearing from a subject matter expert. You are there. And so that's why it's actually a good thing to bring your camera and everything with you, because there's so much you can see and so many filtering mechanisms that it's good to like have recordings and images of what's going on there, and voice recordings and whatnot. And again, once you have done that, the question is, you have all these data now, you have video recordings and photos and audio recordings and whatnot. So what do you do with that? How do you analyze that? And then how do you synthesize this into something that is relevant for you or somebody else? So how do you communicate the lessons that you learned? And there's different ways. You can do affinity diagramming, where you write all the lessons that you have on cards, and with your team, put them into clusters on a white wall. That's affinity diagramming, because the things that belong together are shown in these kind of clouds. You can do things like this, which is a hierarchical task analysis, which is just writing down how is something be done. And it's very, very powerful. It helped me a lot when I went to like domains I had no ideas about, such as power distribution. And you go in there and you basically ask the same question all over again. You ask, what do you do? How do you do this? You say, well, I'm here to manage the power for Western Austria or whatever. It's like, okay, and what does that entail? Well, first of all, I have to do this, and then this, and then this. Okay, talking about the first one, how do you do this? Well, I do this and this. So you basically decompose a whole big activity into its subcomponents. And you go further and further and further down. And the beauty about that is you go sufficiently deep and you talk about user interface quite naturally, because at one point he would say, well, I have to schedule the next shut-off of this one plant. Okay, how do you do this? Well, I have to spec what day it has to be shut off. Okay, how do you do this? Well, yeah, I have to determine the date. How do you do this? Well, see here, I can open this little calendar control and then click on this one button that represents a day. Now you're talking about a level of user interface design, while here you talked about a task or activity level. So that's quite cool. Part of what is done in user interface design and UX design is not only screen level, like, oh, where do I put my button here? Should that button be on the top right or on the bottom left? Or should that button be green or blue? It's also information architecture. Information architecture is about how do you organize content and how do you label content. So it's a more abstract way of designing something. It's kind of like the design before you design. So for example, I was once tasked to harmonize the intranet of a very large company, Siemens. 420,000 people, 16 business units, all over the place, 202 countries. How do you harmonize an information space that large? And so one way to do this is do card sorting. Anybody heard about card sorting before? Yay. So card sorting is just about making an inventory of the contents, of the main contents that a site, for example, has, or a program may have. This could also be features. And then not you, but work with people that are actually users and have them compile these individual items into piles that belong together. It's kind of like affinity diagramming in a distributed way. So you go to the first person and say, here's all the things that we need to show on the intranet. Stock options, corporate policies, holidays, I don't know, whatever. Here are all the content buckets, and obviously not all of them, but the high-level ones, because otherwise it gets too many. And you now put them into piles as you think they should be, because they belong together. And you do this over as many people that you want. Here, actually, the more the better, because you can then use statistical programs to do a cluster analysis. It will bring you back how they're actually grouped together, considering all these inputs that people did. This was just one that I did recently, where we try to understand how people look at our training, our professional training content. And here you see clusters. You cannot read this, but this was a cluster about user research methods. So a lot of people took the content that we had to offer and said, well, we believe all these things here belong to an overarching topic that's called user research. Training about user research. And this here was all the stuff about human factors and scientific stuff like Fitts law and these kind of things. This was on that cluster. So a pretty powerful way to do this. And again, using an approach that reaches out and gets inputs from the actual representatives of the audience. Or again, the same thing for usability testing. Yes, it's a method, and it's powerful, and it has its place, and there can be formative testing and summative testing, whatever. But there's so many different ways you can run this. There's live testing in a lab. There's remote testing. There's moderated versus unmoderated testing. There's performance testing. There is co-discovery testing, where you have like several people interacting with the system and explaining it to each other. So many different ways. Which way makes the most sense for a particular study will depend on what is your question. For example, if you did a performance test where you actually take a stopwatch and across all the participants, you want to count the duration that it takes them to finish the first task and the second task and the third task, right? To then see, well, you know, we see that task 1, no problem, takes them 2 minutes. With the last release, it took them 3 minutes. So we actually shaved off 30% of the time. That's awesome, right? You can do that. But if you do performance testing, you know, you have to tell people that they should work as fast as they can, because otherwise they will, you know, talk about what they're doing and do other stuff, which is actually very beneficial. Normally, you want them to talk as much as possible, because only by them talking, you understand what they are doing. Otherwise, you just like watch them like moving the mouse cursor and clicking things, which is nice, but you want to know why they do this. Where did they look at? What are they looking for? If they don't understand what the submit button is, what was the label that we're expecting on that button? Right? But if you do performance testing, you don't get that, because they should just work as fast as possible. And if they do that, they don't talk a lot. So it really depends on what is it you want to find out. And then also, how do you communicate those kind of results? If you have quantitative results, it's straightforward, right? Because you can show error rates and number of assistants and task execution times and binary successes and whatnot. You can show these in charts very, very easily. The qualitative findings there is a little bit more complicated. How do you show that? And since I mentioned these highlight videos before, they're really powerful, which is literally, if you have a recording of this, and it doesn't have to be from a lab, it can just be like a webcam that's sitting on top of here. If you have a video of the different participants going through these tasks, and you know there are areas and places where they all fail or struggle, just cut them one after the other. Not comment it, just like cut them one after the other. You show this to whoever makes the call on changing things or not, and it's very convincing. So highlight videos are really powerful to convey more the qualitative aspect of the usability test results. Okay, now we're talking about processes. It's really nice that you know what UX is and what methods there are and what design thinking is. Well, in the end, what's the process? What do you do first and then second and third and these kind of things? And then also, UX doesn't live in isolation, but it lives within a development process or an application lifecycle process. So if this was a 360 front-end development process, then we would, for example, think that the UX part of this is starting here and ending maybe around here, when you actually, in the end, document the concept for future use. So all these things you may do. Things like understanding the project's goal and objective. It's obviously not only about UX here. Doing user research, product review. This is about the empathy. Requirements, elicitation and gathering. Starting with the design in a top-down manner, so like information architecture before we actually do screen-level design, interaction design, translating concepts into something that you can actually show to users as early as possible, because then it's more tangible. No user can really understand UML diagrams or these kind of things, but if you have a very simple mock-up that just like links sketch screens and PowerPoint together, that is now interactive, quasi-interactive, more tangible, and you can actually test against that. Visual design, validations to see if you hit your mark yet or not, for example, through usability testing, and then iteratively refining this. And then there's a handover phase where then it's more like the front-end coding and implementation, testing and deployment. So if this is more centric to UX, then how is it embedded into development processes? Well, yeah, it depends on what process the company is running. If you're running a die-hard waterfall process like this, it looks very straightforward because most people assume, well, yeah, in a waterfall process, UX design happens in the design stage. Where else? So yes, it happens in the design stage, but it actually happens in all the stages in addition to that. Why? Because who's owning the requirements? Product manager normally, right? Product manager typically supported by marketing people. Yes, that's true, but when it comes to the non-functional requirements, which are typically the user requirements, who's eliciting those? It's oftentimes the UX people, because they have the methodology to do that kind of stuff. And there's a nice side effect is that's typically the reason why UX people are always the best friends of the marketing people, because they work in a complementary fashion. But UX actually happens in the implementation phase too. How come? That sounds really counterintuitive, right? In a waterfall, design is self-enclosed and done before you start implementation. Why would there happen? Why would there be a need for design during implementation? It's for a simple reason that no specification that design would ever do can be exhaustive. There's no way. You don't even want to try to be exhaustive there. It's not meaningful or valid from a cost benefit ratio. You cannot be exhaustive. And trust me, I tried. It doesn't work. Which means there will be open holes. Some edge cases, some things that come up late in the game during implementation where the developers would ask, okay, well, for this specific situation, I cannot derive what the design behavior should be based on the spec. What should we do? And then it's like an ad hoc mission to like answer that kind of question. Verification, oftentimes UX is involved because of the user acceptance testing, because they actually run the user acceptance testing. And then in the last stage here, after deployment, actually in the maintenance stage, well, we always say, once a product is deployed, it's just the beginning of a new iteration. Because you may have tested all you want before, but now that it's actually live and in the market and it's actually hitting real users, why not go back there as part of maintenance and go there maybe 2 months or 3 months after deployment and see how people use it now, that they have months of experience. Because you may find things that would have never been discovered in usability testing. Because there are some things that may be very, very subtle and not worth mentioning in usability testing, but if people have to suffer through that 8 hours a day over 3 months, it's really, really annoying. Here's where you find out about this, maintenance. Now, in a world of agile, it's getting a little bit more complicated. Because at first, the reaction is always, well, where should design happen? It has to happen in the actual development sprints. Where else? And yes, that's true. But from the nature of what UX design is all about, which is holistic and comprehensive, it has to happen here in sprint 0, which is the preparatory sprint, that here you at least come up with a base design concept that is then refined in the development sprints. But if you go unprepared into the development sprints and say, okay, well, I just showed up, hey, it's day 1, let's have some fun for the next 2 weeks, you will never achieve the one system that is consistent from start to finish and actually revolves a solid and mature core. Because it's just the nature of Agile that you find out during the progression of these projects. And so the same as in Sprint Zero, you would do all your backlog planning. It's that time that you actually have available to do as much user research, to do the empathy as possible, and come up with at least a base concept. Doesn't have to be complete, doesn't have to be super finished, but at least a base concept. And that is hard to do, much harder than in Waterfall. Try to plan for that and try to find enough room to do that. Because oftentimes it's not done in a 2-week period or even a double sprint in a 4 weeks period. It really depends on what the magnitude and the complexity of the system is. And then there are those companies that deploy something that I call the free fall process, which is they don't have any process whatsoever. They literally jump off from the platform and then hope that somehow people will align. And if it doesn't work out, they send in more troops. And even in those situations, you can and should use proper UX design. And the beauty about that is because it is iterative, it's pretty flexible. So I mean, we've been running these kind of projects a lot. And it's just like more political, actually, like to try to align people to a user-centered design process in the lack of an overarching process. Because in the end, every organization in the world that says they do UX uses the same mother process. The process always looks the same. The shapes will be different, the way they are presented are different, but the way it's run in terms of first understand what's going on there, then do ideation, then do iterations, then do validations, it's always the same. And that's why it's mature enough to be also flexible to adhere to different kind of development processes that are out there. And that brings me to my last point that I wanted to make, and that is about standards. And I mentioned the WCAG before, and I now talk about ISO. The good thing about standards is that, especially if it's an international standard like this, is that it provides a definition and methods and criteria that are accepted worldwide. So it doesn't matter if you talk with somebody in Thailand or in Brazil about certain things. If it's defined in an ISO standard, the conversation should be very easy. And so it's good because you have a lot of knowledge and insights about how to do things. The nasty thing about standards is that they are very dry. It doesn't make fun at all to read them. But if you happen, and see this happens all the time, I'm not sure what's wrong with this slide because only when I go in here and I fiddle around with this, it actually shows the rest of the items. Okay, so now you have a double line here. Okay, good. I always say you can get a master's degree and a doctorate and a professor and whatever in UX design. You can read 200 books and 5,000 blogs. If you just read these parts of this one ISO standard, you would know the same. And just people don't do it because standards are dry and boring. But if you read through these couple of six parts of this one standards, it's everything you will ever need to know. It's amazing. This is about the definition. This is about dialogue principles. This is about form design. This is about the whole process. This is about all the mundane things like text sizes, screen polarity, and these kind of things. And what's really amazing about this standard is that it's completely, utterly, 100% in sync with current research. I could never find a single deviation from what research says and what the standard says. They're always in sync. I don't know how they do this because they don't update this every other year, right? Some of them are like 5, 6, 7 years old. It's pretty amazing. So here, my recommendation, if you just want to get started with UX, want to know a little bit more about it, forget about all the books out there. It would take you too many books to actually get to the standard of knowledge that these parts will give you in, it may take you 2 or 3 weeks to read them, but they're really, really strong. And so in the end, I think design thinking is not enough. Design thinking is a philosophy. It's a kind of a way of life within an application life cycle. But you need to counterbalance that philosophy with pure knowledge. The stuff that I just talked about, the human factors, design theory, the methods, the processes, a lot of that is actually summarized in the standards. And if you have both of these together, you can then go about coming up with the next shining example. And that's what I call design doing. You actually have to do design. Don't talk about it, don't read about it, just do design. But do it in a well-founded and grounded way that is user-oriented. So it's actually geared towards the knowledge about the real audience out there, that is really meaningful. It's evidence-based, so it's replacing opinions and belief systems with actual knowledge. And it's systematic in that it's repeatable. It's process-driven, it's planned for, it's budgeted for. You have the right resources at the time when you need them. That's what I talk about design doing. And that is then the promised land that everybody wants to get to. Thank you very much. It's 3:30. Any questions, comments, war stories? I like war stories. Did it make any sense to you? Was it helpful? I have another session tomorrow morning, actually 9:30, about visual design. And it's a little bit more detailed than this overview. So if you're interested, I would be happy to see you tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. Means to accomplish something. It has to be the right thing. Usable means it's easy to learn, it's easy to use, ease of use, usability, learnability, all these kind of attributes. And desirable means that it has value. It is engaging. People like to use it. And you see here completely different dimensions, right? Because useful is having the right product. This is building the right product the right way. And this is having it a rapport between the system and the user. So it's quite hard to accomplish this. And typically, there's also different roles here involved with doing this. Because the usefulness typically is not necessarily owned by UX designers, but that's owned by the product owner, the product manager. But UX can help to identify what our user needs to make it actually meaningful and useful. All right, so how do we get there? How do you get to a system that complies with these kind of quality standards? Did you ever hear about design thinking? Anybody? Design thinking? It's a term that came up in the 60s, and nobody knew about it, nobody cared about it either. But in the 80s, there was and there still is, a company in the US called IDEO, and they had made this concept very, very popular. And it basically says that you deploy, execute, and carry out design thinking if you do these kind of things. You show empathy, you do ideation, you do iterations, and you exude some level of rationality. So let me just show you what this encompasses. Empathy is not feeling sorry for somebody or feeling pity for somebody. Empathy talks about understanding who's using your product, in what kind of context to do what. And that by definition means if the approach of a company is to have a lone designer in cubicle land and then dream up the next generation awesome application, chances that they would fail is really high. Why? Because she's working in isolation. She works in her cube and has no idea about what's going on outside in the world. What are the real needs? What are the real users and what are their characteristics? So empathy talks about really understanding who's the target audience, for what is the application going to be used, and what problems are going to be solved with the application. And this, again, the way that we assume she would work here, having so much fun, is that she uses systems that make total sense. It allows her to accomplish tasks that she has to do in a work environment, in an effective way, in an efficient way, and in a way that is satisfactory to her, is comfortable for her. That's why she's so smiling. This is a different situation. This is now not the office environment. This is not people using business applications. This is more the private context now. So two people looking at the same UI and still having fun. The interesting thing between this and the previous slide is here we talk about consumer applications. And with any consumer good, the interesting thing is that the customer is actually the user, which means that if the product doesn't hit the mark, they return it, they want their money back very, very quickly. While for business applications, investment goods, typically the customer is not the user, which means there's no direct feedback, as it pertains to the satisfaction of the user to the product, right? Here it's very direct. So here, if these two girls would look at a software that would not hit their needs, they would not be as happy, and instead they would just give it back, and then you have loss of revenue. Or look at this one here. So here there's a guy, and he's doing something on the UI. And if you look at the UI, it's not really complicated, right? I mean, this looks like Pong in 1975. It's not a very sophisticated UI, considering that he's the age of Minecraft and League of Legends, like really powerful games. And still he has fun, right? He seems to enjoy himself. And because he enjoys himself, his mother enjoys herself as well. He's happy, she's happy, everybody's happy. So in this specific context, which is more like a public setting, and this guy just walks up to this and tries to, I don't know, like navigate this guy here through this chasm, I don't know. It's a good thing for him, and everybody is happy. It's another example of user experience. And here's another user experience. So this guy may not be completely, enjoying what he's doing, and he could do everything at this point, right? Maybe he was just navigating an e-commerce site and wanted to buy new running shoes, and now he's on page 7 out of the purchasing process and has to re-enter the same information he already did 2 screens ahead. Not a very pleasant situation. Not a happy camper either. And why is that? Well, this is now again the situation where it's more in the office. And it's funny because when I started doing this 15 years ago, and we were doing consulting, companies always paid us money to work on the external facing systems. They always said, well, these are the windows to the customers, these are directly generating revenue. We have to really be good with them. But everything that works on the inside, internal facing applications, that don't worry about it. It's our own people who have to use them. Yeah, we don't have to make them good. 15 years ago, that was a real strong argument. It was very hard to get through that. But today, if she's working on an internal application for her company, who says that she doesn't have to be productive? So who says that the software doesn't have to be super efficient and effective? It's the same criteria that you would apply for external facing software as well. Also about the user satisfaction, which sometimes is tended to look at like a little bit esoteric. It's like, oh no, now you have to make people happy too on the inside? Really? Yeah, really, because you can show that user satisfaction has a direct impact on the bottom line of a company. So people that work with substandard software during the day, they go home after work and they have the newest iPad and they have the newest apps that work and run on the iPads. So they know what's good and what's not good. And so in today's world, when there's a shortage of really qualified knowledge workers, you better give them high standards and good, well-produced software. As a side note, in the UK, I think UK is one of the few countries in the world you actually can sue your employer against when they give you substandard or software that is not ergonomically well designed. You can even sue them here. So that's just to say that it doesn't matter if it's internal, if it's external facing, UX applies throughout. And so what is UX? There's more definitions than there are stars in the sky. But I happen to like this one here, which says it's the envisioned, expected, or actual experience of a user interacting with the technical. Okay, let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back from lunch. I have a really nice presentation for you, mapping to your biorhythm right now, because now you ate a lot, you're a little bit sleepy. I have a full presentation without a single line of code for you, okay? And I call it the promised land, because I'll take you on a journey. Just about myself, my name is Tobias Komischke. I work at Infogistics. Everybody knows Infogistics? Okay, awesome, cool. So we are a US-based company. We provide front-end controls and tools and services around front-end design and development. And we also have an office here in London. And I've been doing that UX stuff for a while, and every presentation I give, I always show that cartoon, because that cartoon many years ago was the first thing I ever saw about the whole topic of usability engineering, as we called it back then. And I think it's still applicable today, in that we want to avoid situations where a user doesn't know where he or she has come from, where he or she is at, and what can be done next. But obviously, UX today is more than that. This is like classical usability. UX is a little bit more than that. And I just want to talk a little bit about what UX is in general. Because if you have experienced UX talks before, they tend to be very specific to things. There may be presentations about research, about screen level design, about evaluation. It's a lot of stuff. And I just want to get a little bit on top of that and like give a more holistic view on what UX is and what it should be and what it can be. So to a lot of companies, UX is kind of like the promised land. They have heard about it, they know about the impact, they hear about all these success stories, and they just want to get there, and they don't know exactly how to get there, and oftentimes they don't even know what UX actually is. They just know we want to get there because the sky is blue and the grass is green. We need to be there. And how do you get there? Well, UX happens in a lot of places. It also happens a lot in the work environment. If you see a scene like this, a good-looking woman sitting in a really nice, well-lit office, having really a blast at doing the work, that is part of what UX is, because the product. I like this definition because it's pretty concise in that, for example, it talks about the interaction with a technical product. So when I call a support line of a company because my Surface Pro keeps crashing every other week, and I have somebody who's completely incompetent on the other line, that's not user experience. That's customer experience. User experience is the interaction with the technical system right there and directly. So that's interesting. The other interesting thing is that we don't only talk about the actual experience, but we also talk about the envisioned and expected experience. The envisioned experience is what the producer wants that software to be. So we want to create a new app. We want to create a new Office application. What experience do we envision it to be? High-end, snazzy, technical, precise, game-like? All this is what we have to decide. But we do this before we build the application, then hope that in the end, it actually stand up to that target. The other one is the expected experience, and that talks about the expectation a user brings to the application even before he or she uses that application. Again, for the consumer world, where the customer is the user, if you pay a lot of money for an application, you pay $50 for an app on the App Store. For that $50, you have quite some expectations, right? So it's you anticipate the use of this, and you have certain expectations to this. And if the application doesn't fulfill that expectation, then you feel that you got betrayed and you want your money back. So that's why I like this. It talks about process, right? The actual experience we can easily measure. There's thousands of methods for this. That's not a challenge. But to understand what the envisioned experience should be, what the expected experience should be, that talks about process, which means that You have to take care about user experience throughout a development lifecycle or even an application lifecycle. And the three typical target criteria that are always mentioned for what user experience is or what a well-designed product is a product has to be useful, usable, and desirable. So useful means it has to be meaningful. It has to provide